So if you've worked with migrations previously and you just want to learn how to set this up inside of Slim, you're pretty much done. You're ready to go and create migrations as you please. But if you are new to the kind of workflow of migrations, what we're going to do is build up that users table that we saw earlier. And we're going to talk about resetting and rolling back changes as well. So if you do need any help with migrations, remember that we are using the Laravel schema builder, and you can find over on the documentation a list of available column types. So anything you need to do in here, as well as loads of other information on this as well. So if you do get stuck, head straight over to here and you'll pretty much have everything you need in there. Okay, so let's go ahead and use Phinx to create our first migration. This is going to be create users table. Just imagine you're starting your project up and you're ready to create a users table or pretty much anything else. Now inside of here, we know that we can use this schema and we can now create a table with a name. And then into here, we get a callback with an instance of blueprint, and we typically name this table. So you're going to want to go ahead and pull this namespace in, or even better, add this to your migration stub so you don't have to keep doing that every single time. You can add anything else in here you want as well. Now in the down migration, we want to use this schema and we want to drop the users table because of course that's the reverse of creating it. Remember, anything you do inside of your up migration, you add the reverse of this inside of your down migration. If you need to roll back, you need it to go back to the state you were in before you performed this action. So now what we can do, as we saw earlier, is just start to add in whatever we need. So we're going to have an auto incrementing primary key. We're going to have a username. We're going to have a email address and a password. And for things like the username, maybe you want this to be a unique value, which kind of makes sense. So you can go ahead and use unique. You can use indexes in here. Again, just go over to the documentation and you'll find everything you need. So we'll also go ahead and add in some timestamps that will create a created at and updated at date. And this is required for any model you create unless you set timestamps to false. And you can do that by setting timestamps to false here. But usually these are pretty useful, so we're going to go ahead and leave them in just here. Okay, so let's go ahead and run this. Of course, we use Phinx in here, and we just use the migrate command on its own. Head over to the database. That should have created our users table with them columns in. Now let's say we go ahead and build out the functionality we need, and then we realize that we want a first name and a last name column. Well, what we don't do is go back and modify this unless we roll back the changes first. What I would typically do is just create a new migration for this just to show the changes I've made. There's nothing wrong with rolling this back and modifying this migration, but I find it a little bit easier to add a new migration as well. So let's go ahead and use Phinx to create a new migration, and I'm going to call this add name to users table, like so. We go over to our migration, we fill this in as normal, and it's kind of at this point that I think it might be nice just to have some kind of scaffolding already set up here. So maybe we just want this kind of code in our stub so we can go ahead and have this ready to go. So I'm going to go ahead and add this into here, and because we're making a modification over in our migration just here, we're also going to need something like table and then the table name, which allows us to make changes to the table. Of course, we're not recreating a table. So for the down migration, we would probably also want something like this to roll back any changes to any columns we add. And as we saw earlier, we're probably also going to need this in here as a little bit of scaffolding, just kind of anything just to help us out along the way. Okay, so now that we've done this, let's actually go and delete this migration. So we can delete migrations if we haven't migrated them. If you've already migrated something that's in here, don't go ahead and delete the file, or you're not going to be able to roll back the changes. So let's just recreate that. That will use that new scaffolding that we added over here, and we can go ahead and just remove anything that we don't need. So we're going to go ahead and remove the drop. What we want to do is add a first name and a last name here, remove the first name and the last name here, and that is our migration complete. So let's go ahead and add these in, and we're going to purposely make a mistake here and then roll our changes back. So let's say we want a string first name, and we want a string last name. And then in here, the reverse of that is getting rid of the first and last name. So let's go ahead and say table, drop column, and you can either do this on separate lines, so you can do the following if you want to, or you can pass an array or just a list of what you want to delete. So let's go ahead and migrate this. So Phinx migrate, that will go ahead and create them. If we go and actually choose the correct table name, so let's add that into there, run that again, and that's gone ahead and migrated our changes. Now at this point, maybe we think, oh, actually what we really wanted was this to be nullable. We don't touch our database schema here at all. We just leave this completely alone. We don't want to modify anything in here now that we have our migrations. So we want to roll this back. Well, in that case, we use Phinx rollback, and that will roll back our last migration. You can roll back specific migrations. You can roll back a batch of migrations. All of that is over in the Phinx documentation. Of course, I'll leave that in the course links for you. So we've rolled this migration back. Because we have that down method, what's now happened is over in our table, we no longer have the first and last name. We can make changes to this if we want to, and then we can just re-migrate. Now, the reason that I like to create separate migrations here is if we already had users that were in our table and we dropped the table on our down migration, then we're going to delete all of our users. So I much prefer to any modifications I make, I add as a separate migration. You're not going to lose your entire user data. And of course, that's particularly important on production when you actually have real users or real data inside of your database. So in this case, what I actually wanted to say when I first created this is I want these as nullable. So let's go ahead and add these as nullable. That of course means we can assign them a null value. We go ahead and re-migrate, and that is it. We're done. So come over here and you can see these are now nullable. Perfect. So that should give you just enough for your workflow. Most of the time you'll be creating tables, you'll be just adding things to tables, you'll be dropping things to tables. And of course, if for example, you wanted to create a migration to drop something, so let's say that we had a migration to remove the last name, the migration would look something like this. So over in remove last name, we would of course use table, and we would use table because we're not creating a new table. And we would, of course, specify the table that we need. What we would do is if we wanted to drop the last name, of course, what we would do is say table drop column and pass in the last name. But then for the reverse migration, we want to recreate the last name, because if we drop it and then we want to roll back our changes, the reverse of this is, of course, to add the last name back in. So in this case, we would just take what we would done before, we would add that in there. If we drop that and we think, oh, actually, no, we do need that, we can revert the migration and that will recreate that for us. So any changes you make here, you mirror them here. That's pretty much it. So let's go and say Phinx migrate. And then we think, oh, actually, we don't need that. So we're going to go ahead and roll back the change. And then maybe we just don't want this at all. So we can go ahead and delete that. Okay, so what we're now going to do is just think about what happens when we start a new project. This is really just to demonstrate the benefit of our migrations. I'm going to delete everything in here. Let's say that we were working locally, we had our project ready to go on our production server, or we're moving it to a new machine. We have the history of our database changes already here. All we need to do when we start our new project is just run Phinx migrate, and that will just migrate everything for us and bring our database up to the state that we need it in. So we've got all of that information in here. Then migrations have sequentially run, and we have our database as we need. Now, if at any time you want to roll back all of your migrations and you don't want to have to go and manually delete these, then a really easy way to do this is use Phinx rollback, as we've already seen, but we specify the timestamp as 0. So if we do that, that's going to roll back pretty much everything. So if we give that a refresh, we still have our migrations table, but that's empty now, but we don't have our users table. So we can just go ahead and run migrate again. That's going to bring that back up to the state that we had it in, as we saw before.